Welcome to the Putting the Public into Health podcast by Dr. Richard Pan. As we face one of the greatest public health disasters in the century, this podcast will address questions and issues from you, the public, about the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on people's health and lives. I am Dr. Richard Pan. I'm a physician with a background in public health, and I am proud to represent the people of Sacramento, Elk Grove, West Sacramento, and parts of Sacramento County in the California State Senate. I want to share with you important information and stories to help each other during this difficult time. America has a long history of police brutality and racism toward Black Americans. The recent killing of George Floyd and the disproportionate death rate of blacks from COVID-19 remind us that Black Americans are not free of justifiable fear for their lives in America. I am honored to have Larry Lee, publisher of the Sacramento Observer, join me. Founded by his father, the Observer newspaper is a leading voice for the Black community in Sacramento and our country. Larry is an influential Sacramento business and community leader, and I am honored to have been in the same American Leadership Forum class with Larry. Thank you so much for joining me, Larry.
Dr. Pan, thank you for having me.
So the Observer is one of the top Black newspapers in the United States and has been in publication for over half a century. How have you seen news coverage of police brutality change or remain the same over the years?
Well, it's interesting. And again, thank you for having me on your show. I think it's vehicles like this that help increase the amount of dialogue that happens not only in our own community, but in communities outside of ours. So I'm very appreciative of being on. I think to your point, there are some systematic challenges that have impacted African Americans really since, obviously you had slavery and then since slavery, and the ramifications of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, those eras have still have remnants here today, and have had those remnants for the entire time that the Observer's been publishing, almost 58 years. It has been police community relations have been something that has been a challenge for our community for a long time. If you look at the origins of policing in and of itself, it has origins back to slavery and keeping slaves in their place and punishing slaves. And so, there's some remnants that still are involved with the system of policing. And, whether it was, 1962 when we were founded or 2020, those challenges still exist. And in some instances, they've gotten worse. I think they've always been there for us. What has changed, obviously, is technology has changed. So there's more of an ability to see things with video and audio and pictures and things like that help illustrate really the terror that many African Americans face on a day-to-day basis.
Now, just 2 years ago, here in Sacramento, we had Stephon Clark killed by police officers. How did the Observer cover that event and its aftermath?
Oh, well, that has been, one of those watershed moments for our community. I think, the Observer has been a weekly publication. As you said, highly decorated as a print publication serving our community. And I think the events of Stephon Clark and those that have followed we were obviously able to illustrate the complexity, I think, of this issue. For many, when I'm asked questions like that, I'm reminded, the reality is, the Observer lives with this every day, right? So, when we talk about the disparities of social justice or healthcare or economics or education, they're things that we call out every day. And so when you have a flashpoint like something like the Stephon Clark killing, obviously those outside of our community get a lens into what it is that is impacting us every day. And so when I say it was a watershed moment for our community, but for us as a publication, I'm not going to say it was business as usual, but, it was just still ongoing coverage of our community. The protests, the policy, the voices, all of those are in the pages of the paper each and every week. And then when you look at, being in the 21st century with digital content, also, reflected on our website and other digital assets that we have, we try to make sure that our community has a voice and can also speak not just to our community, but those outside of our community as well, too, about the challenges that our community faces every day. And so, obviously, we felt like we did a good job of documenting the challenges that moment had for us as a community. But, we've continued to do lots of really good reporting on that. I was very proud of my staff. They did a wonderful job. And in fact, at the end of 2018, we actually named the Clark family our Persons of the Year, which is something that we announce each year for our community. And we were very proud to name them our Persons of the Year because the grace in which they handled such a high-profile, volatile situation. They were spectacular as leaders in our community, and Stavante and Sequette and Sequita and all of them have done an amazing job on trying to let people understand the pain that they are dealing with, but also know and recognize, their platform for forgiveness as well as systematic change. So we've been very proud to salute them in that regard. So, and then, we've definitely tried to make sure that we've increased our digital content as well too. This moment here has also helped with our understanding and realization of trying to make sure we meet people where they are as far as getting them news and information.
No, I appreciate your statement about the fact that this is reality for the Black community every day. I mean, Stephon Clark was a watershed perhaps because it raised awareness for other people who live in not only Sacramento but in the nation, but it basically illustrated the ongoing issues of racism and interactions with law enforcement that African Americans were always facing. Right, it wasn't something new that happened. Now, you talked about policy change. The legislature did pass AB 392 by Senator Weber last year to address police use of force. Do you think that laws like this are making a difference? How was passage of this law viewed by the Black community?
Sure. I think, categorically, we have to have leaders like yourselves and others who are pushing for legislation to address equity in all communities, particularly in California. California is too diverse for us to have many of the longstanding laws and policies that we have. So we've got to continue. I mean, last year we dealt with everything from, AB 392 to the Crown Act, where just the simple fact of having your own natural hair in the workforce is no longer, something that people can get fired over. So I think, we have to have policies like this. Now, speaking specifically about AB 392 and police use of force, here's where I stand, and I think that there is beginning to get some steam on this, is that AB 392 was a fantastic bill. In fact, I mentioned the Clark family being our Persons of the Year. The following year, Dr. Shirley Weber was our Person of the Year for her work with AB 392. So we recognize the value of that. But I think from our perspective, and many in our community, the real challenge that has to happen is there has to be a real honest discussion about police reform. By that, I would compare it to something like education reform. There's no doubt that public schools have, for the most part, done a fantastic job. My children are in public schools, and if you get a good public school, you're in great shape. The challenge is for the least of us, when public schools fail us, they fail us miserably. And so the reality is, in the education space, there's been a discussion over the last 20 years or so about education reform and what sort of options can there be for communities in areas with low-performing schools and how those schools are impacting our children. And so there's been, obviously policy that has helped address that. And I think that we have to get to the point where we say, time out. Is policing as it is serving our community? And I think that is where we have to really, somebody has to stop and say, this isn't working. It's not working for everyone. And if it's not working for everyone, if it's impacting us, the least of us, then we've got to find ways to address it. And so I feel like there is a real need to address policing in and of itself. I've had great conversations with Police Chief Daniel Hahn, who here in Sacramento has been trying to work within the system to do some systematic changes. And he's, to his credit, he's done some positive things when you talk about policing. He's said to me, look, Larry, we're trying to find ways to take our historical responses and address those. So, for instance, when he talks about, if an officer is confronted with a suspect and the suspect takes off on foot and starts running, he said their natural instinct is to run after them, right? That's what they've been trained to do, is to literally run after them. Well, when you start to run after them, then that begins to bring in a whole different sort of dynamics that are not necessarily in the public's best interest always. And so, so he's saying, look, now we're trying to see if we can institute drones to maybe take that element when a suspect runs, instead of running after them, then bring a drone in and start, to be able to give you eyes so you can make a more intelligent decision that's less based on adrenaline and emotion and, a use of force and trying to, manage the line between de-escalation and confrontation. And those things, obviously, there are times and places and spaces where that doesn't work. But I think we've got to assess realistically, how is policing impacting our community? And you cannot, no person can look at the video with George Floyd and countless others, but obviously George Floyd, and say, 3 officers on someone's back, 1 officer standing by, and for, almost 9 minutes, hovering over somebody and with no regard for life. You cannot say that's policing, but someone will justify it as policing. And that's what we have to get to, I think. So kudos for AB 392. I applaud Dr. Weber. We love her dearly, and we need her to continue to push that. But you asked me personally, I think we have to really reassess what policing looks like in our community.
No, I appreciate that. And I think there's both policy and then culture, and they go together. So what are people's expectations in terms of what they're supposed to do as a police officer? What does the public expect of someone, right? Someone goes and runs, they expect them to chase after them. And what are some of the alternatives to doing that? But I think
even to your point of culture, I mean, it's like, and I know there's a lot of discussion about, making police forces diverse and this and that. But I mean, it's bigger than, the individual. It is a culture thing. It's a complete mindset. There was the video of those officers tasing those students coming from school in the last couple of days, and I believe one of those officers was African American. The kids were black. It's not necessarily about, the the diversity of the workforce or even the training within the system as it is. It is a fundamental change of saying this is just not how we're going to do things moving forward. We got to figure that out.
Well, certainly, I think that while it's always been there with the coronavirus, with recent events, we can see how racism is killing Black Americans. Not in all its dimensions, but certainly in some of them. You know, in the past few months, as I mentioned, we've had coronavirus that's killed over 100,000 Americans, with a disproportionate number of Black deaths. Black Americans are dying at over twice the rate as other Americans when it comes to coronavirus. And then we talk about some of the individual events. In February, Ahmaud Arbery is murdered by two white men while jogging. And then in May, we have a white woman confronting a Black man who's just bird watching in the park, who does call her out for violating local law, and then tells him that she will falsely accuse him of threatening her life. And when he refuses to back down, actually does it and calls the police, expecting the police to come. And some people say, well, what's wrong with that? But we then, practically almost the same day, we then see how serious of a threat that really becomes when we have George Floyd, who, when in custody of the police, as you mentioned, there's 4 police officers, and he's killed as a police officer literally kneels, pushes his knee into his neck for over 9 minutes. So, I mean, these are horrible stories that all just happened in the space of a few months, but we also know those stories are just simply the latest in a long string of stories. We talked about Stephen Clark 2 years ago. We can talk about, even here in Sacramento, we had a 14-year-old boy who was, punched several times by a police officer while they're, et cetera. I mean, it just seems like it goes on and on. How sometimes people feel like, is there any hope for the future? I mean, we still have these horrific stories. So how do you report on this? And what do we tell each other about who we are when we keep hearing this? And it seems like it doesn't end.
It's overwhelming, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I think where we're getting to is, this moment that we are in as a nation. I'm an eternal optimist, Dr. Dan. You know me. I try to look at things on the positive side of life. And as challenging as and frustrating as it is, I do feel like right here, right now, at this moment, there is a little bit of an awakening that is occurring. This country has been so divisive, obviously particularly since 2016, but it was long before 2016. And so, it has become so divisive where people are speaking in silos. They are not listening. Dad, one of the greatest lessons my dad ever taught me and told me was there's a reason God gave you 2 eyes and 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you can listen and watch twice as much as you talk. Right? I mean, it's just, there's a reason why we are meant to listen and observe and watch and have empathy for people. And unfortunately, for too many years, this country has not done that. And again, some of this comes from the top. And I'm not going to even speak of the person's name, but everyone knows who I'm talking about. And so this has been a challenge for our country in particular. But I feel like in this moment that we're in right now, there has been a little bit of awakening. I read a memo from Murdoch from Fox News that he sent to his editorial staff at Fox News. And it was so thoughtful in regards to taking a moment to listen to the African-American community during this time and to try and recognize the disparities that we've been facing. You're seeing companies and leaders step up and say, this is not acceptable. And, Dr. King always challenged the silence of liberal folks, as being just as dangerous as, the attacks on our community, because silence in and of itself is violence to us. And so I think, the more that we can have a dialogue with those outside of our community, with our community, of course, but outside of our community, to be able to, have a frank and honest discussion. I was in a meeting with the governor on Monday, and someone brought up to him the real honest truth, the fact that, no one has ever apologized to the African American community about the atrocities that have affected us for generations. Mm-hmm. We know there's discussions about reparations and what does that look like? What does that mean? And I know many people feel like, we're in a post-racial society and all that, but the reality is that's not the case. And I think that, I'm hoping that this moment, we don't have to have another George Floyd moment for us to begin to change this. I feel like this might be different. I'm not sure. I'm still a young man. I haven't seen everything in the world, but I feel like this moment could be different for us as a nation. There's a lot of people who do not look like me, who are marching and protesting and speaking up and saying things that they haven't said before.
Yeah, well, certainly an apology is long overdue and perhaps more. I want to ask you about media coverage, particularly of the aftermath. So we have, people peacefully protesting racism and police brutality across the country. We've actually seen many police officers expressing support for these protests as well. But we also see images of violence, people looting, damaging property, police in riot gear shooting rubber bullets and using tear gas on protesters. How do you view the current media coverage of current events related to the protests? Do you think it's been balanced, or yeah?
Yeah, I definitely think that it is balanced. We've got more cameras and eyes on things than we've had before, I believe. Fewer things can slip through the cracks. I think people are seeing definitely, the militarized response of police. And I think that hopefully that is a problem for people. I will also say, as a journalist, the assaults on journalists have reached an all-time high during these 6 or 7 days. There's watchdog groups that pay attention to how journalists are being attacked or assaulted by law enforcement officers. And I think on average, it's usually there's about between 100 and 150 reports of assaults per year. In the last 6 days, there's been over 190. So on a report on attacks on journalists, we watched, I think it's Omar Jimenez from CNN the other day on live air get assaulted and arrested, I should say. So as a journalist, we're very concerned. There's a reason why the First Amendment that was done in this America is freedom of the freedom of the press. So we are a critical part of helping to tell that story. But I think when you're looking at it from a protester's side of view as well as a law enforcement side of view, I think it's been fair. I think people have seen, young people getting shot with, as you said, with rubber bullets, the tear gas, the flash bombs, all those things. It's frontline coverage, and I don't think it's doing anything but exposing the realities of what's on the ground. So I think, we see, as I said, the militarized response of police is concerning, and that's what it is. The looting, the rioting, those kinds of things, I think most protesters are recognizing that, there's some element out there that is being involved with this, and not many people know exactly what it is. There's a lot of conspiracy theorists. But I think that, we have to make sure as a media entity that we're being responsible and trying to make sure that we show a full picture of what's going on and try our best as well to protect, our staff and ourselves with making sure that our photographers and reporters are being safe.
Well, I really want to thank you, Larry, for spending this time sharing your thoughts and ideas as a leading Black journalist and as a community leader. Did you have any final words you wanted to say about how we should address racism and heal the divisions in our society?
Oh, I wish I had an easy answer for that. Mm-hmm. I think, again, forums like this are important. I think, as I said, listening more than we talk. Talking and listening outside of our silos is critical. We are so divided, and if there's the idea of talking to people that we agree with makes us feel better. There's a certain, and you're the doctor, but there's a certain endorphin, I think, that happens when we talk to people and they agree with us. But the real work comes when we listen to those that we might not necessarily share the same political views with, and try to find a place and space where we can get to, some sort of civility. I'm not the kind of person where I don't think we as a society cannot live together. I've seen this country do amazing things, and I think our laws are actually set up in a way to where they can adjust and correct themselves. But there's some correcting that needs to get done. And I just hope and pray that we can do that honestly and thoroughly as a nation.
Well, those are great words to end on. Thank you so much, Larry, for joining me. And I want to thank you for listening to this episode of Putting the Public into Health by Dr. Richard Pan. If you have questions or ideas for a future podcast, please email them to senator.pan@senate.ca.gov. Please stay at home as much as possible, but don't forget to speak out. Stay at least 6 feet away from others outside, wash your hands frequently, and try not to touch your face. Together, we're slowing the spread of the disease and saving lives. Thank you so much for listening.